Let's get our screen. Actually, we should close that screen.
This one?
Yeah. I think we are broadcasting.
We are live, yeah.
Hi, everybody. Hope all's well and you're part of the universe. We had a good turnout last time from lots of different points around the world. In fact, that's one of the most exciting parts of this course is we get details on where everybody is, and it's kind of thrilling. I mean, we said this last time, but the prospect that we could be talking to a group of people from many different cultures, enough variety of cultures where we could reasonably say this is a broad cross-section of humanity, is fascinating for those of us that are in the humanities, particularly in the field that we're in, where talking about myth and the classical world, the Greek and Roman mythology. For many years, people in my field used to make the claim that this was, the statement of universal humanness. That claim has been modified and adjusted because it's a little grandiose after all. But now we get a chance to kind of test out some of the aspects of this field where people have made these claims to broad, grandiose claims to broad humanness. And well, we have enough of a cross-section of the world to start thinking about those claims again in a more universal way, which I find just fascinating. So it's one of the exciting parts of this course for me. And with respect to that, we had you all had an experience of doing your first writing assignments since we had our last screenside chat. And from the reports on the boards, we know that for some of you it was a maximally enriching experience. For some of you, it didn't go so well. You thought that some of the comments were a little short-sighted. You weren't sure that people had exactly a full appreciation of your own linguistic background, whether you felt like non-native English speakers were judging a native English speaker or native English speakers were judging a non-native English speaker. All of these are important bumps in the road of this process. We thank you for sticking with it. Even the folks that were registering some discomfort with the way the judging was happening in these forums, I think mostly registered, that they realized that what we're doing here is trying something new and experimental. Part of the reactions that you all are having is really the reason why, the single most important reason why we have structured the grading of the class as we have, which is to say, doing the writing assignment and judging 5 other people, writing a review of other essays, giving your views on what your peers have said, that all you have to do is do that without achieving any final number or final high stakes score, and it will count that you have completed the assignment. We didn't want to offload the high stakes burden of grading onto you all, but we wanted to preserve, I think, what's uniquely possible in this particular setting, which is to have this very global group have reviews of each other's views. And I hope you also felt that not only in writing and receiving reviews from your peers, but also in writing your own reviews of other people's essays, you felt that you learned something in doing that. I think that's, in our experience, when we teach the course live here at University of Pennsylvania, having the ongoing interactions between folks that are taking the course and peer reviewing of each other's essays and of each other's written comments, this is one of the most important parts of the course that we have here at Penn. We do things slightly differently because we have a much bigger team of teachers and a much smaller team of students, but we try to do our best to have at least a simulacrum of that in this environment. So that's where we are in terms of thinking about the course, and we've got a lot to talk about today. Your questions have been percolating along, just as they have were in our previous session. We'll spend most of the time talking about those. I also want to direct your attention to our live question portion of the discussion forums on the Coursera site, where you can go and drop in any questions that you have for us that come up as we're talking. And at the end of our 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes today, at the end of that time, we'll turn to those questions to see what's come up while we've been talking. So with that, I'll turn it over to the team. You all know, of course, Sam and Anna, but maybe just one. Oh, sorry, I'm Peter Struck. I should introduce myself again, but you probably know who that. Let me just make sure Sam and Anna have a chance to introduce themselves one more time, too.
Hi, all. I'm Sam, grad student here at Penn with Professor Struck, and you might notice that Anna's not here. She's in another part of the world, just like a lot of you are, so I'll let her say hello from across the Atlantic. She may have frozen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anna, also a grad student like Sam. And yes, right now I'm in Norfolk in England. So hello to anybody who's also on the east coast of England. But hopefully our connections will work enough for me to participate in the chat today.
Excellent.
Great. So I wanted to jump right in with a question that I saw in the Screenside chat discussion forum, I think yesterday, that Soraya Belghazi posed. It was a great question. We've got now all of our 4 myth analysis tools out of the toolbox, and we're going to start using those. But Soraya wanted to know how these 4 tools relate to each other, which is, great question. And particularly, are any of them better or more useful in some situations? Do they sort of look at different aspects of culture? I think that she posed the question in such a way that it was some of them could perhaps look at relative truths, functionalism and myth and ritual analysis, sort of truths that are relative to the culture that's telling them, and maybe there's something deeper and more universal to the what we can get out of using a structuralist reading or a Freudian analysis. And so I guess we want to start with how these tools relate to one another.
I'll just bring up a couple reactions and then turn it over to both Anna and Sam if you all have further things to say. This is a huge topic and it's a very rich question. Let me just give a few, really just a schematic kind of outline of the way I would go about answering this. I think you're right to point to the differences among the tools. And I think that, depending on where you come from in the humanities, there may well be people that are strongly affiliated with one school or another who will claim that they found the way of analyzing any particular text or analyzing any particular myth. I'm not going to claim that in the course that we're in now. What I think my approach to these tools that we have is just that they're tools. They're there, and just as a screwdriver is useful when you've got a screw in front of you, and if you try to hammer a nail with it, it's not all that useful. These tools will do certain things, and other things they won't do. And I have tried to keep in the class over the years I've taught it the tools that, in my estimation, are the most useful, most broadly applicable, that yield the most interesting results when we put them to use. But I'm not going to say that I think one or the other of them is a lot better than another in some general or grand way. And in fact, the results that you get from the different tools sometimes are going to be different, and sometimes even in conflict with each other. It's up to us as ongoing thinking participants in this broad conversation of humanistic study to make our own judgments about which tools work well and which don't in certain kinds of contexts. As I said, I think they all work well. They're all worth our time, but there are times when I think, well, gosh, structuralism works a little bit better here. Myth and ritual doesn't work so well. Or functionalism might work better, and Freud doesn't work so well, or the opposite. So now, going from that beginning point, there's a lot to say about the individual tools themselves. I mean, more than I couldn't even stop talking if I started now for the next 6 hours. Let me just see if I can give you a couple of sentences. It's true, isn't it, that Freud has in mind a kind of universalist approach. I mean, in his understanding, what he's studying is a human psyche. And a human psyche is just that. It's a human psyche. It's not the psyche of this or that particular culture. Now, he'll surely take into account cultural differences where they show up, but it's not what's most interesting to him. What's interesting to him is a universal human psyche, as if he's a medical doctor. Remember, we talked about in the lectures. It's as if he's looking at an organ that exists in a human body. And just as people have spleens in East Asia, North America, South America, South Asia, in Europe, he also thinks people have psyches wherever they are. So he does approach with a kind of broadly universalist understanding. What he's looking at is a product of that same kind of universally held organ. Let's just use that analogy that shows up across many different human cultures. Similarly with structuralism, you'll have a kind of universalist impulse there. They will claim that what we're uncovering here is some very broad, universal, fundamental understanding of what it is to be human. It'll emerge through the language of a certain culture, but the structuralist analysis will, in the end, claim to have revealed something that is very fundamental to what human experience is, with an understanding that it's coming through a particular cultural language. Very different with myth and ritual and functionalism. Functionalism is, exactly, just as you say, deeply embedded in a particular culture. It doesn't make sense for us to talk about myths in a Roman context justifying the same kind of, or legitimizing the same kind of cultural forms that show up in a Greek context. They're going to be up to different things. Now, for the functionalist, there's a certain kind of universal aspect which claims that myths are always doing this. No matter what myths you're talking about, they're all legitimizing the cultural form, some cultural forms. The cultural forms will vary from culture to culture, but it is, in that sense, true that for functionalists, they do have this one kind of universal claim, which is to say that myths always are up to legitimizing cultural forms. Now, when you get to the myth and ritualists, they're talking about something a little bit more specific in their claim. Myths are there in order to articulate and explain some strange ritual custom that we all do, and this myth gives us a reason behind. It tells us a story as to why we do that particularly strange ritual custom. And it's, again, just like we said with functionalism, very much culturally embedded and distinctive to the rituals that are there in any individual culture, and these vary widely across different cultures. However, there is this one quasi kind of universal claim, which is to say that myths are there in order to explain ritual behaviors. So that's just a start. There's much more that you all can say, and I think the level of discussion already on the boards has gone past any of the individual points I've been trying to make. But just so you all know where I stand on this, that's generally it. And Sam and Hannah, if you've got things to add.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I just wanted to draw attention to a thread that we had about Freud in particular. And there was a lot of discussion on the forum about why are we using Freud when he's not the foremost person anymore in psychoanalysis. Like, why aren't we using Jung instead? And there was some good thoughts going on the forum. I think one short thing to say is just time and space. There are many other ways we can think about myth, but this is a 10-week course. We've got our text, so that's one reason why we're using Freud. He also comes first. Jung is going to be building on Freud, so we couldn't really jump straight to Jung without having dealt with Freud first. And there was also sort of a question of that Freud is no longer relevant, is he? He's gone. People have surpassed him now. And I think in the humanities, we don't necessarily throw ideas and things out as quickly as maybe you do in the sciences. That are useful for us. We can still get something out of it. It's also a question of history of scholarship, that it's part of the scholarship now on Oedipus. And so if we're thinking about that play, we need to then think about Freud as well. So those were just a few of my thoughts about why we have Freud. I don't know, Peter, if you have extra things there as well.
Yeah, very well put, Anna. I'll just jump into underscore something you've already said. That Freud is no longer a viable thinker across the way with our colleagues in psychoanalysis in the psychology department here. That is true, fair enough. However, his relevance to the humanities absolutely remains. Now, it may well be that as far as his description of any of the details of how our psyches work, there are lots of questions that our colleagues across the way are going to be raising. But for our purposes, you'll notice how broadly we introduce the general idea of Freud. Freud is making the claim that we are not masters of our own intellectual houses, that there's a whole buried part of the iceberg that is crucial in determining the kinds of desires that we have, and that myths are there in order to express the otherwise repressed desires that a culture has. That still is pretty good. That claim within the humanities and within the study of myth in particular, that claim is still quite pertinent and useful. Whereas some other parts of Freud's theory, more detailed things, the therapeutic aspect, the kind of diagnostics, the kind of prescriptions for treatment, those things may well have been surpassed in other parts of the discipline of psychology. However, the general point that we anchored to our introduction of Freudian ideas absolutely holds for the humanities. It is still a very useful lens to use. So I can't really do it without it. And Jung, there's more to say on that. I think Anna said it all best. Yeah. Anything else?
Maybe I'll move on to the next question.
Okay. Let's move on.
So this was another something I picked up on in the forum threads. I had a great discussion with Vanessa Farkas. She noticed that there are a lot of instances where there are conflicting versions of myths, and her particular example was, well, the Typhoeus, or the Typhon, I mean, he's got different names, first of all, depending on who you ask, This monster shows up and he's sort of different if you look at Hesiod in the Theogony versus in the Homeric hymn to Apollo. His parentage, of course, is the big thing that's different. In the Homeric hymn, he's Hera's child that she created by herself as sort of a way to demonstrate that she was going to take reproductive power upon herself and do what Zeus is doing, which is, going around and leaving children everywhere. And Vanessa was a little curious because in Theogony, Hesiod makes it very clear. Well, he depicts this epic battle that Zeus has with Typhoeus, and it ends up being one of Zeus's hallmark, points on his ascendance to domination of gods and men. And that's not actually in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, but Professor Struck alludes to it when he's discussing the Homeric hymn to Apollo in one of the lectures. And I think Vanessa wanted to know are there correct versions of the myth, or are there parts that we just need to understand whenever we're dealing with one of these mythological accounts, even if it's not expressly in the text? What's going on with Typhoeus and Zeus?
It's a great question, Vanessa. And, well, to start off, there is no correct version, despite what... this is an interesting area of thought, and it's actually kind of fun for me to have spent a lot of time studying this stuff, because the background of Greek and Roman mythology is something that people who like to be experts like to claim that they like to kind of poo-poo people who don't know it well enough. And they think that, well, one version is clearly wrong and the other is clearly right. We just don't have, almost ever, kind of basis for making a judgment that one version of a myth is right and another is wrong. Instead, what we have in antiquity is a lot of different versions. So it's very hard to look down our nose at one or the other representation to say one's incorrect and one's correct. What we have instead from antiquity is a group of more and less authoritative sources. So in the case of something like Hesiod, versus someone writing a Homeric hymn in the style of Homer, taking on the Homeric voice to write it, you've got two pretty strongly authoritative people. They give different accounts, don't they? You're absolutely right of this Typhoeus character, but they're clearly talking about the same beast. The nomenclature changed just a little bit, but it's a slight change in ending. It's in terms of the way the Greek is representing it. It's not a change in the stem, so we're clearly talking about the same creature. They look about the same and they act about the same. They've got this kind of a similarity, this congruence to them that lets us generally, these folks are probably talking about the same figure. However, they do have their different versions. Poets, myth tellers, are going to take whatever versions they need to take in order to tell the story they want to tell. And it may well be that these stories are sometimes in conflict. I made the suggestion during the lectures that the Typhaon character comes up in the Homeric hymn to Apollo probably. Notice I'm only saying probably because I'm not sure about this. And someday I could screw up my courage and thoroughly research it. It would take many weeks and likely months, and I'd come up with a paper and I'd try to get it published, and my colleagues would come back to me and say, no, this is not good enough to publish, you have to look at this. Anyway, I'd have to go through that whole process. If I did and it survived, I'd say, I know this to be true. I'm not going to say that. Instead, what I'm going to say is I suspect that the author has inserted this reference to Typhaon as a way of comparing the strength of Apollo to the strength of Zeus. Now, there's not a claim that Apollo slays Typhaon. Instead, Apollo slays this serpent. Well, the serpent serves, though, as a kind of foster mother for a while to this Typhaon in the Homeric hymn to Apollo. This, I think, sets up a dynamic in which the poet is the poet in the style of Homer here during the Homeric hymn is claiming, you know that story about how Zeus overthrew this awful beast. Well, my guy, my Apollo guy, overthrew that awful beast's mother. So it's like he killed the mother of the awful beast. It's a way of kind of giving a slight one-up to say that, you know, my Apollo is so magnificent that he can do something like this. Keep in mind, though, that no one in antiquity could ever get away with making a play on Zeus's regnant position. Zeus is definitely the person there, the god who's at the top of the heap. And Apollo in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, the poet has him careful to say things like, of course I would never try to overthrow Zeus. That you can always hear too. So. Okay.
So, there were a couple other areas on on the forums that also relate to this, the kind of which is the correct version. One of them was about the birth of Apollo and whether Artemis was involved or not. And in the Homeric hymn that was the set text for this week, she isn't. So if you're reading around in other areas and reading summaries about it, be very careful about where that information is coming from. And remember that the text that we're reading in the class, like that's the version that we're going to be thinking about most in the class, and any quiz questions and things will be related to it. So I just wanted to throw that one in there as well.
Exactly. Thanks, Anna, for that. It is the case that if a person goes to a not fully processed source, for example, like Wikipedia, God love them, I'm glad they're doing what they're doing, but they are not going to be all that useful for you in this class, because what they'll do is take, usually, the many conflicting traditions and put it up into kind of one blended, homogenized story. Well, none of the stories we're looking at are blended or homogenized. They've got edges, and they've got sometimes conflicts. And yeah, the verse that we've been talking about are cases in point of that kind of conflicting nature of the ancient sources. You just need to know, well, what is Aphrodite's background? The best answer to that question is another question. According to whom? Right? Aphrodite has two different stories about her birth, and others as well. So we just need to make sure that we know what source anything is coming from.
And I'll just add that this is actually a really interesting feature of myth, that they're sort of mutable like this, and you can have several different versions that are existing and out there, and they satisfy a different role. So always just keep in mind that what you're reading is authoritative based on that single author. It doesn't have to be the case that that is the be-all and end-all of that version of the myth. So yeah, just always be willing to accept that there's a variation, and this will really, the deeper we get into this class, the more you'll see variations of things that you thought were familiar and set in stone, especially as we move to Rome.
And I think it's probably clear from what we've already said, but let me just put a fine point on it. For those of you out there, some of my best friends are in more technical fields, and they kind of chuckle at us humanities people. We don't ever have a clear answer for anything. Well, fair enough. Sometimes that's true. But, I mean, in this case, it's not the case that anything goes. Whatever I might make up in my own mind is the background of Aphrodite, just happens to be it. That's not true at all. It's, in fact, the opposite. It's not that anything goes. It's just that there's never going to be a single story. And it makes our job as scholars of this material, I think, even more complicated, because rather than kind of toss everything, it's not as though we're going to just kind of toss everything off and say, oh, we just can't really know. We've got to know the multiple traditions and find out where they're coming from. It makes for a picture of complexity, even with very straightforward and simple questions.
Okay, I think I've got the next question. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the role of women and the attitudes to women that are coming up in our text, because since our last chat we've read Hesiod and his creation of women. We've then come into Homeric hymn to Demeter and sort of what happens to Persephone at the hands of her father and her uncle. And then, of course, now we're into Aeschylus, and we've got Clytemnestra. And so there are quite a few people on the threads thinking and taking issue with, responding to these strong opinions about women, that are attitudes about women that are coming through our myths. So we wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that, the role of women, the status of women, what we're seeing in the myths that's causing people to react so strongly against it.
Fascinating question. Thank you for that. I believe this is, well, there's multiple people that we had coming up with these questions. And it's true. These questions do come out, I think, with particular urgency. And that urgency, I think, has to do with our own cultural time, our own locatedness in culture. The question of how gender was portrayed in these myths was not as urgent 100, 200 years ago as it is now. And that's a fact. That's an artifact of our own time. Now, I say that with some caution, because sometimes when people make a claim like that, they then say, and therefore it's not that relevant, because it only has to do with us, not the real stuff. I don't find that to be true at all. I think there's always going to be, I think I said this last Screenside chat, there's going to be two levels of analysis when we get, I think probably across the board, but surely in the case of questions of gender, that are absolutely legitimate. Number one, let's try to, as best we can, reconstruct the story of how gender was viewed within the context of the time that we're reading about. No question that that is a useful, valuable, and important thing to do. And then number two, a separate kind of inquiry, let's go ahead and reserve the right to make a judgment about how that culture constructed views of gender, where we might go ahead and perfectly well say, well, they thought that about gender. That doesn't match what we think about gender. And that kind of a conversation, first of all, carefully constructing a value judgment, that's perfectly good to do. From our own perspective, good. That's fine. Make sure also it comes into conversation with the density and complexity of the ancient material itself and the kind of gender construction that it's doing. So I think that two bifocal approach to this question is the most useful one. Now, yeah, it's definitely the case that when you look at these figures like Clytemnestra, we've already seen it or to some extent, we've seen some double standards come up in the case of Penelope. But Clytemnestra is maybe even a more interesting one. She's an incredibly strong woman. And in the case of Aeschylus, the way he portrays her and the way the audience would have reacted, she has qualities about her that they would have thought of as being man-ish. She speaks in public, she's direct, she speaks her mind, she's an actor, she's physically acting things out in the public square. These are the kind of things that are more characterized by male gender than female gender in kind of lived life in antiquity. However, we need to also be a little cautious. Remember, when we were reading about Penelope and having some conversation about that, I wanted to make sure at the beginning of our conversation about gender that we realized, we talked about this in the previous Screenside chat, but that we realized that, sure, we can go ahead and make broad statements about the lower value of women with respect to men across antiquity. However, we've got to also understand, without whitewashing anything, the very powerful roles that women and female characters play. So we have these incredibly strong women, and it's not just Clytemnestra that gets a powerful central role. She's this very difficult figure with this kind of tricky reputation, and the gender dynamics are here linked up to a case of someone who's really hard to fully endorse. I mean, she goes out of her way to kill her husband and all that. Right? She's a tricky character. But we've got other characters in tragedy that are portrayed as central, who have very rich, full, complex lives. We understand their psychological development. They're very sympathetic, who are also gendered female, without all this complexity in tragedy. That, in addition to the fact that we have very strong, powerful female characters, we have very strong female deities. All these things need to be, I think, brought together into the complexity of the stew that we're going to make when we try to make broad comments about gender and antiquity. And mostly, I think it's safer for us to make narrower statements about particular moments and particular pieces of the stories that we're looking at when it comes to the question of gender. Sam, Anna?
Yeah, I'll add to that. Just, gender that was a rich discussion in the forums, but that was not the only place that I saw strong emotional responses to things that were clearly culturally sanctioned in the Greek world and are far different now. And it's okay to have those responses and to sort of question them and judge them, but make sure you're harnessing that judgment to sort of put yourself, well, okay, if this is something that's so incredibly different, I can't imagine a scenario where I would kill my mother. And that's fine. I couldn't either. But you can use that as a tool and sort of put yourself in Orestes' place and think about, well, okay, so what is his concept of justice? And use these as access points into the sort of psychology and behavior of these cultures rather than as, red flags that you say, well, this is nothing that I could ever relate to. It's okay to be, horrified when Zeus gives his young daughter away to Hades, basically, to live in hell, effectively. You can be horrified at that, but at the same time, you can also tease out of that, well, okay, so the cultural norm here is that the father of the household can do what he will with his children, and if that is give his daughter away against his mother's wishes, that's fine. And that comes out in the course of the myth, because that wrong is never righted at any point. So we're just looking at two different cultures, two vastly different cultures, and you always need to keep that in mind when you are making your judgments. It's okay to judge, and it's okay to feel, that this is different and wrong, and it doesn't necessarily jive with what you come to expect humans to do. But at the same time, it's a different people in a different time. I'll pass it off to Anna if she's got something she wants to add to that.
No, I think you guys have got it covered.
Okay. So, well, we've sort of transitioned into tragedy, which is great. I think these are some of the richest texts we look in here, and I wanted to sort of bring to the surface here a question, a long, ongoing discussion that I participated in on the forums this week about particularly the difficulty of reading these texts. And a lot of you noticed right away that reading Aeschylus is a lot more demanding of your head and sort of every part of your reading muscle than it is to read Homer. Sort of a simple narrative that flows pretty naturally is much different than these riddles of choruses and these deeply sort of abstruse metaphors and things that come out of the language of Aeschylus. And I sort of did my best to apologize for the translator, Richmond Lattimore, because I think he really does do justice to the Greek, and he's not just making this artificially ornamented because he likes to do that because he's a poetic translator. He really is trying to represent to the best of his abilities, and I think he does a great job, the very difficult and the very kind of challenging poetry of Aeschylus. And so, Professor Struck, I was just curious if you wanted to add anything to that, if you want to defend Lattimore or sympathize with the readers who are struggling with Aeschylus.
And I'll let your explanation of Lattimore stand, Sam. I have nothing to add there. I think it's true. You know, when we're looking at tragedy, the key thing for me to remember is compression. It's a very compressed art form. Epic is expansive. You've got hundreds of lines, thousands of lines, and you can just kind of keep going. Tragedy, you need to do it. You need to put together a tragedy that, when strung together with two others, makes up a trilogy and can be viewed in one day, in one event, in 3 different sittings. This is what these tragedians did, and none of these sittings was longer than, you know, an hour and a half. I mean, how long can a person sit still, right? So that's what they were dealing with. They crammed as much as they could into this very compressed form, so it has that feeling of compression to it. Also, just a quick reminder, I mean, the audience that's viewing these tragedies already knows the whole story. They know all of it. So when the chorus makes a very compressed and riddling reference to some arcane factoid about the family background of Clytemnestra or Aegisthus, the audience is going to pick up on that instantly. They're going to know exactly what that means. You know, analogies today, we see it all the time. There's highly compressed forms that assume that you know a whole lot. I think Americans these days produce tremendously good satire. That's one thing that I feel as an American, I can thump my chest a little bit and say, hooray, Americans are really good at satire. I'm not sure what else we're great at, but The Simpsons is really good satire. It's incredibly compressed what happens in those little 18 to 20 minute animated cartoon things. They've got thousands of references to things that if you weren't already up to speed on, they'd go right over your head. Just by that comparison, I draw the line to the kind of compression that happens in our tragedies. They're a different kind of art form than what's happening with the contemporary confections coming out of the Simpsons stable. But it has this sense of compression and the understanding that the audience already knows the whole thing, so you kind of get right to the next stage, the next development of the rich plot. So it's definitely different.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate that Aeschylus in particular, I think, is infamous as being difficult. And for those of us who spend our time reading this material and working with it, Aeschylus is Greek, and the choruses, and in general, like, you all have my sympathies for struggling through it and really trying to understand it, because it takes a lot of work. But I would never expect an English translation to smooth out all of that difficulty. That difficulty is there, and the layers are there. And that's what we then want to see in the English as well. So we're sort of stuck with it, I suppose. That actually segues really nicely to my next question, which was coming from Christopher Prele, who just wanted to know a little bit more about the performance context of tragedy and the context in general of how and why, and who the audience is going to be coming in to watch this. So Peter, you talked about that everybody will know these things, and Christopher wanted to know, is it then only going to be the elites who are coming, who are educated? So who's going to be in that audience sitting watching these plays in Athens?
A great question, and the answer is it's what we're talking about is an audience that is mostly going to be elite and educated. They're going to be the kind of people that have had a background in the material. They have also taken enough of an interest in it over time to have to have devoted a significant amount of time to actually getting to know it, and will have enough money to have leisure to be doing this kind of thing. This is not Shakespeare's England. In Shakespeare's England, you've got an art form, I think, that you can make a claim to. This is actually where the theater is actually quite a popular art form. Here, not so. The stories are pitched to the elites in society. Now, it's going to be also true that these the basic mythic background here is broadly permeated all the way through the society at all levels. So the basic materials that are being worked with in the tragedy are widely disseminated across many different classes in the society. But the audience at a Greek tragedy is going to be more toward the high end of that group, different than Shakespeare.
I'm sorry, I'm watching the questions pile up here. But yeah, I wanted to, I mean, as we're talking about tragedy, I think I'll let that stand as far as the context, the social context of it, and the performance context. But another sort of note of that came up in the discussions was Andrea Benke asked a question about the role of the chorus, because that's something that's very different, and clearly it's certainly important in Aeschylus, and if we keep reading, we'll see that the role of the chorus is somewhat diminished in Sophocles, and more so even in Euripides. But just in general, if there's any sort of historical context you want to add for that, because it is kind of interesting that tragedy very much is these two sort of genres, the dramatic genre where you have actors on stage, and then the choral part where these actors are also on stage, but they're clearly doing something quite different.
Yeah, let me just say one or two things to say, and then turn to you to see if there's some things that you would want to add. You've got this background where you have the likely development of this is that you've got group singing that has been happening for some centuries prior to the development of tragedy, where whole groups would get up and sing songs. And then eventually the idea was, let's pull one person out, and that person can have a kind of solo voice. Well, that solo voice then started to have conversations with the choral group, and the solo voice could then take on slightly different persona and start taking on characters that were being talked about by the whole group, at which point we bring out another person, we can wind up having dialogue, and off we go. As tragedy develops, more actors are pulled out so that you can have more people on stage at once. It's not the case early on. Early on, we've got only single figures in pairs and then threes of people that can have individual conversations among each other, with this choral group as a kind of anchoring element behind that crowd, always singing a more kind of corporate, with a more corporate message.
I'll just add to that a really interesting thing that people who study theater or tragedy in general think about is the fact that if there are only 3 actors ever on stage at once, and there may be 8 or 12 characters, you've got to make some judgment calls as to which actors can take on the other roles, because of course an actor who's playing 2 characters, they can't be on the stage at the same time. So you actually do have to kind of do a mathematical consideration when you're casting one of these stage plays to make sure that you never have conflict of actors who are supposed to be speaking to each other but are in different costumes, wearing different masks and all of that. So the history of tragedy is really rich, and people since antiquity have been kind of puzzling about where exactly it came from and its origins and everything about it. So those are great questions to have, and it's nice to have that context, I do think, as you're reading this a little bit. And Anna, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that?
No, I think good.
Okay. Well, we have, I suppose we can move on to, we're running a little short on time, but and we wanted to at least look at some of the questions that were on the forum. And this one, not a lot of new questions in the course of our sitting here. You can ask now, and I'll try to register them. But this was an interesting question that I think I saw in another thread, and then Maureen Nori, she moved it into the screenside chat thread, and it was just about the background of the Agamemnon and Clytemnestra story. And I saw, some others of you were I think feeling around on your various sources and noticing that there are some conflicting thoughts about why Clytemnestra might have a motivation to kill Agamemnon beyond her daughter Iphigenia. I think someone brought in a reading that Robert Graves did that claimed that she had been sort of deposed of her rightful throne, as the heir to the throne of Mycenae, and that Agamemnon was sort of a usurper in that sense, even though he was her husband. And I'm wondering, this maybe goes into some alternate versions of the myth, but I think that was a rich discussion that people wanted to hear more on.
Interesting. Well, I want to also toss this over to Anna. The potential for a more complex background, I think, is definitely going to be there. And the Graves reading that you introduced is the right one to go to in this particular case. The trick is always going to be the sources. We can find these little glimmers of these counter-narratives buried in either other plays or sometimes even within the plays that we have, but they're always going to be tricky to prove in any definitive way. What we do know for sure, and all of these cases prove, is that we've got a complex, many multifaceted set of traditions that are being moved around, and they're being moved around by poets doing the work that they want to do for the particular work that they're engaged in. Aeschylus' version is the most authoritative version of this story, but it's not the only version of the story.
Yeah, and I think we were also on the forums, there was some talk about Iphigenia and her background story, the different variations there. And this is a case where we do have different authoritative versions of this. So in some, that Agamemnon does just sacrifice her, but then Euripides has done sort of slightly later tragedian, 2 other plays about that background, where she's taken away at the last minute, and there's a deer in her place, and she gets taken somewhere else to work as a priestess. So within this myth, in the background, there are going to be those different bits and pieces, but we've got the Aeschylus version that we're reading at the moment, so that's what we kind of have to go with mostly. Right,
without papering over the complexity of it, and the Iphigenia stories are excellent ones to point to. 2 very authoritative people, Aeschylus and Euripides, say very different things about it. So what we need to say is whose version, always. That's the next question. What happened? Well, in whose version? That's the next question. Anything else?
We might be towards the end of our time here.
Okay.
Unless, Anna, did you have any last questions that?
I think there was just like one small fun one that I think Steve mentioned on the forums. Just quickly off the top of your head, if you could add any one text to the course for people to read, what would it be? What would we add in? I personally was thinking maybe one of Seneca's tragedies, possibly something else like the Thyestes, or something that's also in this Agamemnon, House of Atreus storyline. But then we'd get a glimpse of tragedy in Rome, and how that's going to change it culturally. But we'd also be tracking, again, one of the same myths. So that was what I was thinking I would add.
Off the top of my head, that's a great question. It'd be interesting. So in the period after classical Athens in Hellenistic Greece, there's sort of a revival of a lot of these mythological forms by these academic poets who are doing very, very different things, but they're still trying to sort of be like Homer. So I would maybe say Apollonius of Rhodes wrote an epic poem about Jason and the Argonauts called the Argonautica. And that'd be a really interesting take on something that we'll see more when we get to the Roman poets, who are kind of recycling these Greek myths and with their own, cultural investments. So it'd be interesting to see even just a little bit deeper down the Greek timeline, because already classical Athens is pretty far after Homer, and then another 200 or 300 years removed from that, and you've got this new group of authors who are doing things. So I'd say the Argonautica would be interesting.
2 great ideas. I'll just add a third. I'd love to do the second 6 books of Virgil's Aeneid, and I'd also want to add on the Iliad. Just from an aesthetic response. There is nothing like reading the Iliad. Reading the Odyssey, there's nothing like that either. But if they were old enough in time, that's where I would want to go. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for coming here. I've also got I want to close with one final announcement, and that's congratulations. Sitting to my left, you can now call him Doctor, We've got Sam had good news. Sam successfully defended his dissertation in recent days and filed the whole behemoth with the university this morning. So we can toast to him, Dr. Sam Beckelheimer. Cheers, Sam. Congratulations.
I appreciate it.
Good luck with the reading in the coming weeks. We'll have one more of these Screenside chats, and please keep the questions coming. Good luck out there.
See you later.
Stop. Yeah.